Her name was Chinaza, a bright, outspoken girl with dreams far bigger than the dusty streets of her village. But somewhere along the way, her dreams made her ashamed of the woman who raised her. Chinaza mocked her mother, Mama Ifeoma, for wearing old wrappers and selling vegetables by the roadside. She wanted the city life, the designer clothes, the spotlight, and when a scholarship opened the door, she slammed it shut on everything she came from. But life has a quiet way of humbling even the loudest hearts. When the glitter faded and the lies caught up with her, Chinaza found herself on the streets, alone and hungry, until a stranger's kindness began to open her eyes. This story is about pride, regret, and the power of a mother's love. If you're ready to feel, to reflect, and to witness a journey of redemption, then stay with us. Subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Chinaza had always believed she was meant for more, not just more than the tiny mud brick house she lived in with her mother, but more than the entire village that seemed to sleep beneath the same slow sun each day. At 16, her eyes sparkled with ambition, but it was tainted by a growing bitterness. She hated how her school uniform was always a little faded, how her shoes had thin soles that whispered when she walked. But most of all, she hated how people looked at her mother, Mama Ifeoma, with that familiar pity in their eyes. Mama Ifeoma worked tirelessly in the village market, selling vegetables and local herbs. Her hands were calloused from years of lifting baskets and grinding leaves, her feet cracked from walking barefoot through heat and rain. Yet she never complained. Every coin she earned went toward Chinaza's books, school fees, and the occasional snack to tuck in her daughter's school bag. But Chinaza didn't see the sacrifice anymore. She only saw shame. While other girls had mothers who drove them to school on motorbikes or wore bright lace and gold bangles, hers tied her wrapper twice to keep it from slipping, her hair always hidden under the same faded scarf. Chinaza began to distance herself. She would walk ahead when they went to church together, speaking softly so people wouldn't hear Mama Ifeoma's thick rural accent. She cringed when her mother called out to her in front of classmates, and if anyone asked what her mother did, she'd mumble, "She's just at home," as if selling food was something to be embarrassed about. She didn't notice how her mother's eyes softened with hurt each time she pulled away, how the older woman stayed up at night stitching torn parts of Chinaza's school bag or hand-washing her uniform with care. Chinaza didn't see it, or maybe she did, but didn't want to. She was convinced that success meant leaving it all behind. And yet, it was this very hunger to escape, this deep yearning for something greater, that would soon lead her down a road where she'd come face to face with the truth about pride, love, and the kind of riches money could never buy. The words slipped out of Chinaza's mouth like poison, and once they were said, there was no taking them back. "You're the reason I'm suffering," she snapped at Mama Ifeoma one morning, tears stinging her eyes not from sorrow but from frustration. The day before, Chinaza had been mocked in front of the entire class when a girl laughed at the holes in her socks during a group activity. She had walked home in silence, each step heavy with the weight of invisible shame, and when she got to the door and saw her mother rinsing bitter leaves in a rusty bowl, something in her snapped. Mama Ifeoma stood frozen for a moment, her wet hands dripping beside her as the words echoed between them. She looked at her daughter, not with anger, but with a sorrow that cut deeper than any scolding ever could. She didn't defend herself. She didn't remind Chinaza of the many nights she went to bed hungry just so her daughter could have a full plate. She simply wiped her hands on her wrapper and returned to her task, her silence louder than any outburst. But Chinaza didn't stop. She began to list everything she hated, how they were always behind on school levies, how she never had a new outfit for cultural day, how people whispered behind their backs. She wanted to hurt her mother, to make her feel just how miserable she felt walking through life carrying the weight of poverty like a birthmark. In her teenage mind, blaming Mama Ifeoma felt like the only way to make sense of why she was stuck in a life she never asked for. Mama Ifeoma stayed quiet that night, but in the stillness of her room, with the oil lamp casting soft shadows across the walls, she prayed silently for her daughter. She asked God to protect Chinaza's heart from the bitterness of the world, to give her strength, and to help her see that love often wears old wrappers and tired smiles. Chinaza, however, lay wide awake in the next room, clutching her pillow, still too angry to see that she hadn't just hurt her mother, she had wounded herself too. What neither of them knew was that life was preparing a lesson, one that would test every ounce of pride, strip away false confidence, and reveal what truly mattered when everything else was gone. The days that followed felt heavier than usual. Chinaza stopped speaking to her mother unless necessary, and even then her words came out clipped and cold. Mama Ifeoma, though clearly wounded, didn't push. She simply continued with her routine, waking up before dawn to fetch water, preparing Chinaza's breakfast, sweeping the compound, and heading to the market with her woven tray balanced gracefully on her head. Her strength was quiet, almost invisible, yet it held their small world together. Behind that strength, however, was a woman silently breaking. Mama Ifeoma had never asked for much in life. She hadn't finished school herself, and her dreams had been small, just enough to raise her daughter with dignity and hope. Every hardship she endured was swallowed with the belief that it would all be worth it if Chinaza succeeded. That's what kept her going through years of aching backs and sunburned skin. But lately, she had started to wonder if her daughter would ever see her not as a burden, but as the very foundation of every step forward she had taken. She remembered when Chinaza was still a little girl, wide-eyed and full of questions. The child would run home from school and sit beside her while she sorted vegetables, asking about the stars, about cities beyond the hills, about what it meant to be successful. Mama Ifeoma would listen patiently, her heart swelling with pride. She encouraged every dream, no matter how distant it seemed. Back then, Chinaza would hold her mother's hand in public and beam with pride when she said, "This is my mama." But those days felt like a distant echo now. The market women had noticed the change too. One of them leaned over and whispered, "Your girl is growing wings." Mama Ifeoma forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Deep down, she wasn't angry at Chinaza. She knew what poverty could do to a person's self-worth. She had once been a young girl herself, full of shame for having nothing to wear on festival days. She understood the sting of being laughed at by those who seemed to have more. But understanding didn't make the pain any lighter. That evening, as she watched Chinaza eat silently with her head turned away, Mama Ifeoma felt the lump rise in her throat. She turned her face toward the window and blinked quickly. She wouldn't let her daughter see her cry. Love, to her, meant enduring, even when your own child forgets the sacrifices you made in silence. Even when your reward for unconditional care is a heart full of thorns. She reminded herself that storms don't last forever. One day, Chinaza would understand. One day, she would come to see what gold looks like when it walks barefoot and wears a torn wrapper. Until then, Mama Ifeoma would carry her pain quietly, as she always had, wrapped in strength and laced with hope. News travels fast, in small villages, but nothing spread quicker than the announcement that Chinaza had been selected for a scholarship. It wasn't just any scholarship, it was one that covered full tuition, boarding, and even allowances at a prestigious secondary school in the city. The entire village buzzed with excitement. For the first time, Chinaza's name was spoken with admiration instead of judgment. People clapped Mama Ifeoma on the back at the market, calling her the mother of a future leader. But while the village saw it as a blessing, Chinaza saw it as her escape. She barely waited for the term to start. The day the official letter arrived, she read it aloud once to her mother, then tucked it into her bag with trembling hands. Mama Ifeoma's eyes were wet with joy as she gathered items for her daughter's departure: a bar of soap, some old wrappers to stitch into inner linings, a pair of sandals with slightly worn soles, and a tiny Bible. She packed it all in Chinaza's small metal box, the one that had once belonged to her late father. She handed it over with pride and a trembling smile, whispering blessings under her breath. But Chinaza was cold. She looked around their tiny room for the last time with indifference. The uneven floor, the patched-up curtain, the smell of firewood lingering in the air, it all made her chest tighten with resentment. To her, the scholarship wasn't just an achievement. It was freedom, a chance to become someone else. And part of that meant cutting ties with the past, with the poverty, and even, though she didn't say it aloud, with her mother. When it was time to leave, a small crowd gathered at the motor park. Chinaza stood in her slightly oversized school uniform, looking more like a young lady than the little village girl who used to run barefoot across dusty roads. Mama Ifeoma held her hand the entire time, even as Chinaza gently tried to pull away. Just before she boarded the bus, her mother pressed a small wrapped gift into her hand. Inside was a hand-sewn handkerchief with her name stitched in faded thread. "So you remember who you are?" Mama Ifeoma whispered. Chinaza forced a smile but barely looked at it. As the bus pulled away, she didn't wave. She stared ahead, chin high, heart racing. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful, important. She didn't cry, didn't look back at her mother shrinking in the distance. In her mind, the city held the promise of everything she had ever wanted: status, respect, maybe even a chance to reinvent herself. What she didn't know, what she couldn't see through the dust cloud behind the bus, was that this journey wouldn't just take her away from her village. It would take her through a storm that no classroom could prepare her for, and would eventually lead her right back to where she began, but with eyes that finally saw. The city welcomed Chinaza with everything her heart had longed for: towering school buildings, paved roads, girls with polished shoes and smooth, confident voices. But it also confronted her with the truth she wasn't ready for. She didn't belong, at least not yet. Her uniform was crisp but second-hand, her accent carried the rhythm of the village, and her school box, though neatly packed, gave away the fact that she had come from a world far simpler than this one. The first few days were filled with stares and quiet giggles. One girl wrinkled her nose and asked, "Where are you from again?" Chinaza paused, then forced a smile and answered, "Abuja," before we moved. That first lie was small, but it opened the door to many more. Chinaza began to construct an entire story around herself. She told her classmates her parents were business people who had passed away in a car crash. She said she was raised by an aunt who traveled abroad often, which was why she never received visitors. When girls asked why she never had fancy toiletries or new bed sheets like the rest, she laughed it off, saying her aunt believed in simplicity. Each lie came easier than the last, wrapping her like a warm cloak of protection. And as her confidence grew, so did her popularity. She was funny, intelligent, and charming when she needed to be. Chinaza quickly became someone others wanted to be around, especially Ngozi, one of the most admired girls in the class. With Ngozi by her side, Chinaza felt invincible. They shared secrets late at night, giggled over teacher crushes, and talked about dreams of the future. But even in her brightest moments, a shadow lingered. She had blocked her mother's number, ignored the occasional texts that managed to slip through, and deleted every voice note before listening. She convinced herself that detaching from her past was necessary, that Mama Ifeoma, with her dusty wrappers and calloused hands, was part of a life that no longer fit her. Yet sometimes, when the dorm was quiet and sleep was far from her eyes, Chinaza would pull out the old handkerchief her mother had given her. The stitching was rough, the fabric already worn thin. She never showed it to anyone. She told herself she kept it only out of habit, not sentiment. But each time she touched it, a tightness grew in her chest, a feeling she couldn't explain and didn't want to name. Still, the lies continued. It was easier than admitting the truth. And as long as no one found out, she would be safe. But life has a way of peeling back what we try hardest to hide. And for Chinaza, the truth was already creeping toward the surface, patient, silent, and waiting for the moment to reveal itself. It started with whispers, low at first, barely noticeable. A curious student had visited Chinaza's claimed hometown during the holidays and found no trace of the wealthy relatives she had so proudly spoken about. Someone else noticed how her provisions always ran out too quickly, how her clothes were carefully kept but clearly old. A few giggled when her accent slipped during debates or when she mispronounced certain English words in a way that hinted she wasn't quite the polished girl she pretended to be. Chinaza ignored it at first, brushing off the stares and questions with a confident laugh. But deep down, fear had started to bloom. She knew her stories were fragile, stitched together with nothing but desperation and pride. And now, they were beginning to unravel. The breaking point came during Cultural Day, an event filled with color, music, and proud heritage. Students were encouraged to dress in traditional wear that reflected their roots. Chinaza, terrified of revealing her background, borrowed a borrowed outfit from Gozi, a bright, elaborate dress that belonged to her cousin in the UK. She wore it with heavy makeup and confidence like armor, spinning stories about being part of a royal lineage from another region. She dazzled that day, laughing and posing for pictures, her lies flowing smoothly as ever. But someone had been listening, quietly, carefully. One of the teachers, an observant woman named Mrs. Agbaje, had remembered Chinaza's scholarship form. She had visited the village once on a government project and recognized the name Mama Ifeoma. With a gentle but firm tone, she approached Chinaza in the staff room the next day, holding up the registration papers. "You said your parents died, but this says your guardian is alive and living in Umuahia village. Is that a mistake?" Chinaza's heart dropped. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The silence was too loud. Behind her, a few prefects stood with arms folded, watching her. News spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, even the juniors were whispering. Chinaza, the girl who had fooled everyone, had been lying all along. The betrayal felt personal to many. Ngozi didn't speak to her. Her roommates moved their things away from her bed. Girls who used to greet her with hugs now passed her like she was invisible. The school didn't expel her, but the damage was done. The trust, the admiration, it all dissolved overnight. And the loneliness that followed wasn't loud. It was quiet and suffocating, like walking through fog with no direction. Chinaza tried to hold her head high, but it was heavy now, bowed by the weight of truth. She avoided the dining hall, skipped extracurriculars, and cried silently into her pillow at night, remembering how she used to laugh at her mother's humble ways. For the first time in her life, she saw what pride had cost her, not just friends or reputation, but her own peace. And though she didn't know it yet, this fall from grace was only the beginning. Life had more to teach her, and the next lesson would not wait. When midterm break arrived, every student packed their bags and excitedly rushed home to the warmth of family. Parents came in polished cars, aunts and uncles with smiles and snacks in hand. But Chinaza stood at the gate alone, her small bag dangling from her fingers. She had no one to call. She had long deleted her mother's number, and even if she hadn't, she couldn't bear the thought of showing her face in that village again. Not after everything. The school porter, noticing her hesitation, asked gently, "Your people not coming?" Chinaza forced a smile and mumbled something about delays, then waited until the compound emptied before walking away with no clear destination. She wandered the city streets for hours under the blistering sun. At first, she thought she'd stay with Ngozi or another classmate, but none of them returned her calls. Her name had been smeared, her reputation reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in school corridors. Chinaza, once adored and admired, was now invisible. The city was large, but it felt like it had no room for her. She tried looking for cheap lodging but was quickly turned away. She had only a few naira left, barely enough for a bottle of water and a small piece of bread. For 2 nights, she slept at a noisy motor park, curled up on a wooden bench, trying to stay alert while pretending not to be afraid. On the 3rd night, a guard chased her away. "No loitering here," he barked, waving a stick. Chinaza ran, her feet blistered from walking, her stomach twisting with hunger. As the days passed, everything that once mattered, appearance, pride, reputation, melted into nothingness. The city lights mocked her. The glamorous shops and beautiful cars that once inspired her now felt like they belonged to another world. She missed food, she missed clean clothes, but most of all, she missed her mother. Mama Ifeoma's face kept appearing in her dreams, soft, patient, always watching. She remembered her mother's cracked hands gently rubbing her back when she was sick, her steady voice singing softly in the kitchen, her eyes that never judged but always saw. One evening, weak and trembling, Chinaza sat near a street vendor, watching people walk past without noticing her. She had become the kind of person she once looked away from, the ones who sat on sidewalks with empty hands and hollow eyes. In her lowest moment, she realized something painfully clear. She had traded love for status, truth for lies, and now she had nothing. Tears streamed down her face, not the bitter, angry kind from months ago, but quiet ones filled with regret. She whispered a prayer, barely audible. God, if Mama still loves me, show me. It was the first honest thing she had said in weeks. She closed her eyes, not knowing where to go next, unaware that help was already on its way, in a form she never expected. The skies opened that night with a downpour so heavy, it felt as if the heavens were weeping with Chinaza. She had taken shelter beneath an old shed near a row of abandoned kiosks, her thin blouse soaked through, her teeth chattering from cold and hunger. She curled into herself, arms wrapped tight, eyes staring blankly at the glistening puddles that formed around her. Every part of her body ached, the ache of cold, of shame, of emptiness. Her lips moved silently in prayer, though she wasn't even sure what to ask for anymore. She had never felt so invisible. Then, through the blur of rain and streetlight, a soft voice called out, what are you doing here in this rain? Chinaza looked up and saw an elderly woman in a faded shawl, holding an umbrella over her head and a nylon bag in one hand. Her face was warm, kind, lined with the softness that comes from years of seeing life's pain and surviving it. The woman knelt beside her without hesitation and placed the umbrella between them. I don't have anywhere to go, Chinaza murmured, voice cracking. The woman didn't ask for explanations. She just reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of bread, a sachet of water, and a clean wrapper. Eat something first. The rest can wait. Chinaza hesitated, then took the bread with trembling hands. She hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. As she chewed slowly, trying not to cry, the woman gently wrapped the cloth around her shoulders and waited. There was no rush, no judgment, just quiet care. After a while, the woman stood and said, My name is Mrs. Uche. I live not far from here. You will come with me tonight. You'll sleep under a roof, bathe with warm water, and rest. Tomorrow you can tell me everything or nothing. It's up to you. Something in her voice broke through the walls Chinaza had built around herself. She nodded silently and followed. Mrs. Uche's home was small but neat. A single-room apartment with a wooden bed, clean mats, and a kerosene lantern that gave the space a golden glow. She handed Chinaza a towel, warm rice, and a pair of dry clothes that smelled faintly of soap and comfort. That night, Chinaza lay on the mat, staring at the ceiling as the storm outside roared on. But inside her, something had quieted. The next morning, as the smell of boiling tea drifted through the room, Mrs. Uche sat beside her and said gently, You remind me of someone I once knew. A girl who thought she had to run away from her roots to be worth something, but she found out the hard way. Your beginning isn't something to hide, it's something to carry with pride. Chinaza blinked back tears. She hadn't said a word about her life, yet somehow this woman saw straight into her. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just kindness, it was grace. And perhaps it was the answer to the prayer she had whispered in the rain. It took Chinaza 2 more days to gather the courage to speak. When she finally told Mrs. Uche the truth, the lies she had told, the shame she carried, the way she had turned her back on the woman who loved her most, she expected to be scolded, maybe even shunned. But Mrs. Uche only nodded gently, her eyes steady and kind. You're not the first to forget where you came from, she said, but it takes strength to go back. And it's time. Chinaza didn't argue. Something inside her had shifted. The pride that once puffed her chest now felt like a burden she was ready to put down. She borrowed a small amount from Mrs. Uche for transport and promised to repay her someday, though the old woman simply waved her off with a smile. Go home, my daughter. She's waiting. The journey back to the village was long and humbling. Each bump on the road seemed to echo her thoughts, reminding her of all the times she had walked past her mother with disdain, ignored her quiet sacrifices, and twisted her love into shame. She clutched the handkerchief Mama Ifeoma had given her, now worn and frayed at the edges, as if it were the only thread tying her back to the life she once rejected. As the bus pulled into the familiar dusty station, her heart pounded so loud she could hardly hear anything else. Nothing had changed. The same women still sold roasted maize by the roadside. Children still chased chickens in the sand. The same scent of wood smoke lingered in the air. But everything felt different to Chinaza now. Warmer, fuller, sacred. She walked slowly toward their compound, feet dragging with every step, her eyes stung with tears she couldn't blink away. At the gate, she paused. The old wooden door was slightly ajar, and from inside she could hear the sound of a broom sweeping the yard. She stepped in quietly, and there she was, Mama Ifeoma, thinner than she remembered, sweeping leaves into a pile beneath the guava tree. Mama, Chinaza said, her voice barely a whisper. The broom stopped mid-sweep. Her mother turned slowly, eyes widening as they landed on her daughter's face, drawn, weary, soaked in regret. Chinaza dropped to her knees right there in the sand, tears flowing freely. I'm sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Mama Ifeoma dropped the broom and rushed forward, kneeling beside her. She didn't ask questions, she didn't demand explanations. She simply wrapped her arms around her child and held her close, rocking her like she was still a little girl. You came back, she whispered, pressing her cheek to Chinaza's. You came back, my daughter. And in that moment, beneath the shade of the guava tree, surrounded by dust and silence and love, Chinaza felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt whole. The days that followed were slow and healing. Chinaza helped sweep the compound, fetched water from the well, and sat beside her mother every evening as they peeled cassava and shelled beans. No one in the village asked where she had been, though their eyes followed her with quiet curiosity. And that was fine. Chinaza didn't need to tell them. For the first time in her life, she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. One evening, while folding laundry under the setting sun, Chinaza noticed her mother staring off into the distance, lost in thought. Mama, she asked gently, why didn't you ever try to stop me from leaving? Or come after me? It had been the question lingering in her heart, and she finally had the courage to ask. Mama Ifeoma's eyes softened as she sighed and sat beside her. Because I knew your heart was full of fire, she said. And fire doesn't listen to water until it burns. She reached into the folds of her wrapper and pulled out a small, time-worn notebook. The cover was worn, and the pages were filled with careful, tidy handwriting. I wrote to you every week, even though I had no address to send them to. I prayed over every letter, every word. I told God, please watch over her. Please hold her when I cannot. Chinaza opened the notebook with trembling fingers. Each page was dated and filled with prayers, stories from the village, reminders of childhood, words of love. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she flipped through them. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't need you to know then, her mother said. I just needed you to come back when you were ready. It was then Chinaza understood something far deeper than regret or forgiveness. Her mother had never stopped loving her, even in her silence, even in her absence. She had been present. Through every prayer, every word scribbled into those pages, every sleepless night. Weeks passed, and Chinaza began to help her mother sell vegetables in the local market, not because she had to, but because she wanted to stand beside the woman she once tried to hide. She realized there was strength in humility, dignity in honest work, and beauty in the very life she once despised. One afternoon, a few young girls passed their stall, laughing loudly, their faces painted with pride. One of them whispered something about the girl who ran away to be rich and came back with nothing. Chinaza smiled and handed them tomatoes. Be kind to your mothers, she said softly. You'll understand one day. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Chinaza leaned against her mother and whispered, I'm home now. And for the first time in years, she meant it completely. Thank you for staying with Chinaza's story to the end. If it moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories just like this. Your support helps us keep telling these stories that matter.